Hello everybody, this is V Timms or White Zulu, and I'm going to give you another chapter from my autobiography, White Zulu. Welcome to my channel, and I hope you enjoy my readings. So I'm going to start with chapter 6, called The Umgeni River. At 6,000 feet, high up in the mountains, in the foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains, on a plateau called Lyndhurst, on the furthest boundary of our 5,000-acre ranch, underneath a kopje called the Drinkkop, is a tiny spring. This bubbles out from among the rocks at the base of our kopje and forms a tiny stream which tumbles over a small waterfall and then flows into a large vlei or marsh, which collects various other smaller springs and becomes a brook and then a river, which winds its way down into the valley in cascades. It becomes bigger as other streams flow out of the dense, dark forest to become the Umgeni River, without the usual African accoutrements of crocs, hippos, bilharzia, or even a drop of pollution. Water is crystal clear and pristine, and we use the sweet, pure water for drinking as well as bathing. After filling up Midmar Dam, the Umgeni River falls over the Howick Falls and down through KwaZulu-Natal to eventually flow out into the Indian Ocean in Durban. By the time it has reached the Dargle, it is already too polluted to drink safely. And by the time it's reached Durban, it is a filthy, disgusting, stinking mess, and no sensible soul would put a big toe into it. Grandpa had placed a pipe under a tributary cascade high above the house, which runs into a reservoir in the pine plantation. The water is then fed by gravity down another pipe to the house below. Grandpa had shown us how to tell whether water was drinkable. We had to turn over a small rock and look underneath. If there were little mayfly larvae wriggling underneath the rock, then we knew it was safe to drink. The first time I ever tasted town water was my first day at boarding school, aged 12, and the chlorine flavor reminded me of lavatories. I was so disgusted that I gagged, and to this day I cannot stand the taste of treated water. In the dry winter months, as the river falls to trickle, its rushing sound is reduced almost to silence, rising again to a roar during the wet season. Almost daily, this sound rises to a thunderous roar after our regular midsummer storms release a cloudburst into the valley, swelling the river so that it overflows the banks. These floods come right up over the low concrete bridge which spans the river, effectively cutting us off from the rest of the world. The original bridge, which Grandpa had built to access the ranch, had been a flimsy affair made from logs, cut from the bush and packed with soil, and was washed away completely in the 1950s. The Nationalist Party Government Roads Department replaced that bridge with a hideous concrete causeway strong enough to take army tanks. The army needed to be able to get to Mbandla, the Zulu location, high in the hills behind our farm. In those days, South Africans called any African township, small or large, a location. If trouble brewed among the natives there, they wanted to be able to get tanks up there to sort the unrest out immediately. By unrest, they meant any uprising and rioting against apartheid. And sorting it out involved shooting rioters, and not necessarily with rubber bullets. When our parents were planning one of their annual skiing trips to Austria or Switzerland, and there was a likelihood that the water would surge over the bridge, preventing them from crossing, they would book into Rawdon's Hotel, just the other side of Nottingham Road, for a couple of nights ahead of departure to ensure that they wouldn't miss their flight. Umgeni River formed a permanent background to our everyday lives. There'd be a perennial panic caused and fueled by Mum's obsession with the weather as it affected her garden. When the first spring rains were late and we'd had no rain for up to 7 months. The whole farm, apart from both our huge areas of indigenous bush, was tinder dry, and the tension would be palpable as Mum got up at first light every morning, long before anyone else on the farm, apart from the roosters crowing at the huts, were awake. She'd walk down to the edge of the front lawn, peering through the shrubbery to see if any of the pools in the river visible from there had sunk any lower. Then she'd minutely scan the skies for any signs of cloud. She would anxiously gaze at the pine plantation to check for indications of smoke, and lifting her head and standing on tiptoe, turned south to see if there were any untoward or suspicious signs of fire coming from the nuns at the Umgeni Port Convent in the far distance, way down the valley towards where the Intlizan mountain lies. Little time Mum spent at breakfast between tearing around with a half-finished cup of coffee in one hand and a pencil in the other, making lists on scraps of paper in case someone was going into Hooson's, our nearest general dealer's store at Nottingham Road, 20 miles away on a dirt road. She'd interrogate Dad, who'd sensibly lain in bed with his early morning tea, brought in on a tray by Mackay, and listened to the local weather forecast on his transistor radio. Every spring, this ritual and Mum's anxiety levels escalated as the entire place became more and more desiccated, until one could almost hear the vegetation crackling as it dried up. The river level sank in reverse proportion to that of Mum's blood pressure, and she'd begin to talk as though the entire farm had already gone up in smoke, especially heard daily reports of runaway bushfires in neighbouring areas. I hear that the Baldwin's wattle plantations are on fire, she'd say despondently. It's just a matter of time before ours goes up in smoke too. They're too close to our boundary. And so her days were spent fretting over what she had decided was the inevitable. Every night throughout the years, we'd eat our 3-course supper cooked by Masango, all 6 of us seated at the dining room table, with its full accoutrements of crystal and silver, fresh flowers from the garden that morning, and candles lit, and each dish served to us by Mackay, wearing his red sash and a little white fez cap. If it was a clear night, the whole family would walk out onto the front lawn, us kids in bare feet, even though there was a thick frost on the grass in winter, and we'd gaze into the sky to look for signs of rain. It was mainly to appease Mum's constant anxiety, but it was also the only really pleasurable activity we did as a family. Others usually involved a trip to Durban to visit the dentist, a horrible ordeal. The only other time we six congregated was when we sat down for our 3 daily meals, and a slightly tense atmosphere as Mum watched our table manners like a hawk, and Dad insisted that we either made conversation of general interest or didn't speak at all. There is absolutely no light pollution in the valley, so we have the full impact of the Southern Hemisphere constellation. There's nothing quite like the African night skies. The Milky Way actually blazes in a full, broad arc from horizon to horizon, dotted with bigger individual stars scattered here and there, and the Southern Cross stands out proudly, easily identifiable and pointing towards the celestial South Pole. Later on, after 1957, I was 7 years old, when Sputnik was launched. Over the ensuing years, we'd gradually see more and more flashes of sunlight being reflected off satellite solar panels as the numbers being launched increased. We also searched for shooting stars, meteorites racing across the sky to vanish, calling to one another to make a wish as we spotted them. We left the homestead at New Forest in the mid-2000s after Mum and Dad retired to a village called Amberfield in Howick when they were in their late 80s, and my sisters built a new homestead slightly further up the valley and right on the Umgeni River, where my sisters, my sons, and my grandchildren continue to stand on that front lawn, searching the skies every clear night. The reason for abandoning the old homestead was that it had been eaten away by borer beetles, which had got into all the woodwork, including the yellow wood sitting room floors, and one had to be careful not to fall through onto the ground below. It's always fun to see who'd be the first to spot the giveaway intermittent flashes as the satellite went rapidly past, rotating in its orbit, seemingly among the stars. I was hopeless at this game after the age of about 15, and before it was discovered that I was seriously myopic, short-sighted. I then hated wearing my thick, clunky Coke bottle bottom glasses so much that I would have put them down somewhere and forgotten where. Mum would drag our attention away from the skies once we'd established that there were no promising signs of oncoming rain, and turn our attention to the perilously low level of the river, shushing our excited conversations so we could listen intently to hear if the water had somehow miraculously risen, possibly from a rainstorm high up in the flays up on top. As we stopped our chatter about stars, meteorites, and satellites to listen, The night noises of the bush took over. There was the constant chirping of crickets in the background, interspersed by the occasional croak of a frog, anticipating by the rising temperatures that spring was on its way. A male wood owl would give off his mournful hoot, immediately followed by his mate's hoo in response. The surprised owl, as we called it. We always found every owl call spooky, as, since we'd been born, all the Zulus had dinned into us that there are many and various superstitions about owls in general. The spotted eagle owl is the most notorious for causing havoc by setting spells on unsuspecting Zulus, possibly because it has ear tufts suspiciously like horns. It has a deep and sinister, to us anyway, long, low hoot. These calls came from the gum trees surrounding the house. But in the deep bush across the valley came a whole lot of different noises. There is the volley of grunts that becomes faster and louder, climaxing in a series of noisy and blood-curdling screams, which genuinely sounds as though someone is being murdered. These come from the bush babies, as we called them, but are actually tree hyraxes, the arboreal cousins to our dassies, and their hair-raising, spine-chilling screams can go on all summer long, and usually all night long as well. Guests who were new to spending nights with us would come ashen-faced and extra early to breakfast, asking querulously whether anyone on the farm had been murdered during the night. We do actually have plenty of thick-tailed bush babies resident in the bush, but they aren't vocal. Bushbuck rams bark occasionally, giving out their dog-like alarm call as leopards prowl the bush, or a bush pig would disturb them. Most alarming noise of all is when, in the pitch dark, a leopard would jump into a tree in which the baboon troop was roosting that night, and snatch one from the lower branches. The entire troop erupts, screaming, howling, and roaring in terror, giving off futile alarm barks as the body of a hapless young baboon is carried off in the big cat's powerful jaws, possibly still screaming, and the babies shriek shrilly as their mothers grip them tighter and try to carry them higher up the already overcrowded tree. This hideous racket echoes up and down the valley for some 20 minutes before the troop eventually, gradually settles down again. Mum quite enjoyed these catafreya, catfights, as she'd say with some satisfaction, one less baboon, bloody vermin. There were plenty of other nocturnal animals in the bush, but unseen during our nightly family gatherings. Large spotted jennets prowl the trees and hunt the forest for rodents and nestlings. There are plenty of mongooses too. Big, fluffy, black water mongooses hunt waterfowl, and there are others. The solitary yellow mongoose hunts at night, as do the large grey and slender mongooses. White-tailed mongoose, also as solitary as the others, is a common nocturnal predator, preferring the deepest part of the bush. And we had them all, but sadly we don't have those enchanting groups of diurnal mongooses like the banded and dwarf mongooses which are always so entertaining to watch. There are plenty of other nocturnal creatures roaming the 5,000 acres of varied habitats of our ranch. In the valley and up on top, where the escarpment flattens out, there are caracal, otherwise known as lynx or rooikat, which, along with black-backed jackals, carried off some of our lambs and even a few full-grown sheep, and were enough of a nuisance to farmers to have a bounty of £1 for each tail handed in to the Nottingham Road police station. In the same way that my grandfather and my father would call in the baboon boy. There was a similar enterprise called the Jackal Pack, which had consisted of a Zulu man with his pack of Izikadoi mongrels, who would hunt down these scavengers for a price agreed between himself and the farmer. Then there are aardvarks, which we called ant bears, those strange humpbacked animals with sparse hair on their tough, leathery bodies. They have extra long snouts and even longer tongues, and only come out at night. They dig deep holes in the veldt looking for fat, sleepy termites, and slurping them up with those extremely long and thin, sticky pink tongues. They are related to shrews and elephants, rather like dassies are. We called dassies rock rabbits, but they're actually hyraxes. There's a deep superstition among the African about aardvarks because they're so seldom seen. Most nocturnal creatures have some kind of folklore or superstition attached to them. The only evidence for them is their calls, what they leave behind in the morning. Traditionally, before cars and electricity were introduced to the country, no Africans would venture out of kraals or bomas, thorny enclosures, after nightfall because of the many predators roaming around in the dark. If they were in their bomas, all the light they could produce was a flaming torch to keep lions, leopards, and hyenas off their stock, and that light only showed glowing eyes reflecting back. So it was easy for Africans lying inside their dark, smoky huts with no windows and only the light coming from the dying embers of the cooking fire to imagine that the strange and mournfully repetitive call came from Usvolo, the goat-sucker, a sinister creature which crept in, somehow magically impervious to the thorns of their boma, and drank milk from the nanny goats. Instead of the fiery-necked nightjar, a small innocuous bird, which feeds on nocturnal flying insects, as it really is. We 4 little girls cowered in our single bedrooms, way out of earshot of our parents, deliberately so, having heard all these horrific stories told to us by our Zulu nannies, and petrified out of our wits. Aardvarks always infuriated Dad, as they chose our airstrip to dig their burrows, leaving humps and bumps of earth everywhere, which made the little Cessnas and other small planes that used the strip lurch all over the place as they taxied to take off, and leap about alarmingly when landing. The other thing that made him so cross was all those hidden holes they left after digging so deep in the long, tawny veldt grass. All of us, girls and grooms alike, had to watch out all the time that his polo ponies and our own mounts didn't put a hoof into the hole, sometimes somersaulting and throwing its rider. In our area, ant bear holes are the most common cause of a horse's broken leg. There is the night creature the Zulus call imbodla, the African wild cat, which is so secretive that we never got to see one. They are lone hunters, bold enough to prowl the areas near the house and sheds, where there are plenty of rats among the lucerne bales. They approached the fowl run at the back near our veggie garden, where Mum's fowls were supposedly safely locked up each night, and occasionally managed to squeeze in through an overlooked hole in the netting to grab a roosting hen and rip its head off, eating what it couldn't carry out. Even young house and stable cats had been carried off and killed by these isimbodla, much to our distress. Among the bigger predators, like the jackals, are serval cats, but they seem to leave our lambs alone, and there are plenty of smaller predators, such as the white-striped weasel and the striped polecat, prowling silently around the garden and the rest of the valley, marking their own various territories with a stinking spray which drove our dogs into a frenzy of excitement, and into which they'd roll if they could find enough of it, particularly the polecat's leavings, forcing us to bath them in diluted Jay's fluid after they came back triumphantly, reeking enough to make our eyes water. They were always led by Pitts, my dog, who had the thickest coat of them all, and who struggled the most vigorously during baths. After about half an hour of our weather watching, and when, in the summer months, the mosquitoes had really begun to plague us, or the frost nipped our bare toes in winter, we trooped back into the house, Dad stopping briefly to tap on the barometer which hung on the front veranda, peering at it to see if there was any change in the direction of the brass arrow indicator. I always enjoyed this all-year-round nightly family ritual, as it was the one and only time the six of us stood as one, animatedly inspecting the skies, silently straining to hear the river in winter, and having to talk loudly over its roar in summer, when the clouds came up and down our valley flashed. Sorry, when the clouds came. When the clouds up and down our valley flashed continuously with silent sheet lightning, long after one of our major daily blitzkrieg thunderstorms had rumbled away down towards the convent. On the very hottest and almost sultry nights, it was too stuffy to sit in the house, so we'd switch on our nunu insect killer. This was a simple but effective wire cage surrounding a bare light bulb. It was green-colored and unobtrusive in the daytime, but once switched on, really came into its own. The bright light from the bulb attracted a variety of moths, from the huge, fat pine moths to tiny pale ones. These fluttered helplessly into the now live bars of the cage and sizzled and sputtered as they burnt and fell to the red brick veranda floor. As they lay there, still twitching and smoking, large toads of every description hopped into the pool of light cast by the solitary light bulb and began to feast on their freshly grilled prey. There could be up to 10 or more toads all clustered there on some nights, busily gobbling up this bounty. It was only when we saw night adders slithering in, intent on catching their favorite meal, a plump and succulent toad, that we would beat a hasty retreat back into the house, as there was no way of telling where on that dark floor we might put our bare feet on an unseen snake. In summertime, which is the rest of the years round, the river's background sound rises to a thunderous roar after our regular daily thunderstorms released a cloud burst into the flays, the catchment area on top of the escarpment, swelling the river so that it overflowed its banks, and then continues down into our valley, still unleashing a flurry of torrential rain, thunder, and lightning, which constantly struck the conductor on our tin roof. Worst of all was when we had hailstorms, with massive hailstones, which shattered our windows until the mid-1960s, when Mum eventually had hail shutters installed. That's all for this week. I want to thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're getting a picture of the valley and the river and our day-to-day life. You'll find many photographs on my website, www.whitezulu.com. And I want to thank John Moslane for being so helpful in assisting me to make these videos. Without him, I would never be able to do this. So thank you, John. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Goodbye.